It happened. Jake Paul now has a legend, a genuine legend of the game. On his resume, he defeats Anderson Silva here tonight in Glendale, Arizona. It's a unanimous decision. He pulls away late, wins the last 3 rounds on all 3 judges' scorecards, even knocks down Anderson Silva with a counter right hand in the 8th round. And here we are. My name is Shaun Al-Shatti. This man is José Youngs. You already know this is the MMA Fighting post-fight show. And Jose, Jake Paul just beat Anderson Silva. What is your takeaway from what we just saw?
I mean, he beat him fair and square, too. I mean, we talked about, like, worst-case scenarios, this and that, like Anderson getting melted, Anderson losing. And I said on the preview show, like, I just wanted a good fight. I didn't really have a horse in the race. The MMA fan in me obviously wanted Anderson to win, but at the end of the day, I didn't really care. But Jake Paul beat Anderson Silva fair and square. A lot of people scored it for Anderson, I think, but just as many people, I think, scored it for Jake.
Do you think a lot of people scored it for Anderson?
I do, because I do. When I went through Twitter and I asked some people on Media Row, I said after the fight, as soon as Jake got that knockdown, I was standing next to Casey, who's behind the camera right now, and I said, well, we looked at each other and go, well, that's the fight. Jake Paul just won this fight. And then when they read the scorecards, I was like, that, you know what? I have nothing to complain about. Jake Paul beat Anderson Silva fair and square, and you can even see before the scorecards were even read, the camera went to Jake Paul's corner and he was celebrating, and they went to Anderson's corner and he was
upset,
pissed. I can't say what he was saying because then we'll get demonetized. But he was saying a lot of colorful words. He knew he had lost. He even said, like, I failed in the strategy, like I failed. So Anderson knew he lost. I think a lot of people in Media Row knew he lost, but there was actually a surprising amount of people that did score for Anderson, or he was at least winning going into the final round.
So ultimately, I mean, it was a very entertaining fight, right? It was a competitive fight. Going into that last round, which you said, I think ultimately was the decider. For a lot of people, it wasn't actually on the scorecards. The scorecards were wider
weird,
regardless,
right? That's
which
weird.
is strange to me, but it's boxing, right? But going into that 8th round, I had Anderson up 4-3, and then obviously the knockdown, I had Jake Paul winning the fight ultimately. Where did you sort of end up on your scorecard?
I was live scoring, I had Anderson up, but it wasn't like he was pulling away. I thought just Anderson was just outboxing Jake Paul, but Jake Paul was clearly landing a lot of punches, and I was even, like, me and Casey were watching, we're like, this is a really, really good fight. Like, I had a lot of fun watching this fight, and when the second I had Anderson winning, the second Anderson got dropped, I said, that's the fight. That is over. But I think I had Anderson. I don't remember what my exact scorecard was, but I think I gave the slight edge to Anderson going to the final frame.
It's so funny now where we land on this whole saga, right? Because this has sort of been something now for the last couple years. It's been a very slow, I mean, I don't even know if very slow is right, because it doesn't feel like it's been a slow escalation. It's been a pretty fast escalation. You start with Ben Askren, you go to Tyron Woodley, and now you're all of a sudden fighting Anderson Silva and knocking down Anderson Silva in the middle of this fight and winning this fight comfortably, ultimately, on the scorecards. Did Jake Paul surprise you a little bit tonight? Because I think coming into this, right, there's a lot of conversation we had throughout the week with just our MMA media pals, even just, you know, the boxing media, et cetera, of Jake Paul hasn't fought a guy who really knows how to box yet. Jake Paul hasn't fought a guy who knows how to throw combinations yet. He hasn't fought a southpaw. He hasn't fought somebody bigger than him. There were a lot of things that were
southpaw.
There were just a lot of partitions that were being thrown up this week that all of a sudden we now have some answers. Did he surprise you in there with what he looked like?
He surprised me in the sense, like, everyone said the same thing. He's young, he's fast, and he hits really hard. But the strategy that he sort of implemented, where when Anderson would push him into the ropes and kind of try to, you know, get these flurries, these close flurries, this dirty boxing, Jake Paul would immediately, like, clinch up and, like, stop the action, and then you see Anderson, like, just go, and then the referee,
he's kind of playing around with it a little bit. I saw him pat his head and tap on his back.
That sucks to watch, but it's the right thing to do if you're Jake Paul. Like, don't take damage, force the referee to stop the action. The clock doesn't stop, and they bring you back, and then they separate you, and then you get reset. So Jake was doing the right thing in there, and he even said, like, the punch that dropped him was not something he planned for. Like, you remember when he knocked out Tyron, he saw that opening because he was faking, and then went up. That was just a flurry. So I am supremely impressed with Jake Paul's chin. I am extremely impressed with his ability to just throw bombs with Anderson Silva. Like, Anderson threw at him, he countered back, and vice versa. And I was impressed with he had the ability to just stop the fight and slow it, much to the chagrin of Anderson Silva.
I will say add to that I was impressed with his ability to keep his composure in there
True.
while fighting Anderson Silva, while Anderson Silva is doing the Anderson Silva stuff,
Yeah.
right? Because ultimately Jake Paul is a 25-year-old kid who grew up watching this guy, idolizing this guy, and you watch him do it to Forrest Griffin, you watch him do it to Stephen Bonner. I would imagine it's a lot different when he's
Yeah.
standing in front of you doing all of that, and you can manage to push through that and stick with your game plan.
Yeah, it's like imagine playing basketball with Michael Jordan, and then Michael Jordan like goes for that fadeaway, and you're like, I've seen this a million times, and then you are prepared for it, and you block Michael Jordan. Like, never gonna happen, but that's essentially what Jake Paul did tonight. He fought his childhood hero and just bested him. It's crazy. It is crazy to think about, but here we are.
Here we are. I mean, the MMA community, I would say the relationship between it has with Jake Paul is, there's a lot of adjectives you could use. Let's just say it's interesting, right? And even this whole week, we've said it amongst ourselves. This felt almost like an MMA event, even though it was ostensibly
100% an MMA
a boxing event.
Yeah.
There was nothing but MMA media. I mean, obviously some boxing media
of
too,
course.
but a lot of the conversation was MMA media talking about MMA. There's fighters associations being thrown out.
Uriah
George
Hall,
St. Pierre
Chris
is
Avila was
here.
there, yeah.
It's just generally it was a very MMA event. Even the crowd felt very MMA heavy. I mean, Anderson was getting lots of love here tonight. Jake Paul got
he
booed.
got booed a lot.
Is this the one though? I mean, beating Anderson is a lot different than beating Tyron Woodley, and it's a hell of a lot different than beating Ben Askren. Is this the one that gets Jake Paul that respect in this community?
If it doesn't, it's a massive step forward, because you're always going to get, and I don't agree with almost anything Jake Paul says, but I do agree with everyone's like, oh, Anderson's 47, oh, he's past his prime, oh, he's only had a couple fights, like I'm younger and faster, like everyone's going to say that. But having Anderson Silva's name on your resume for the rest of your life, you can never take that away. If Jake Paul never fights again, the fact that he has Anderson Silva on his resume, you can't take it away.
And he knocked him down.
And knocked Anderson Silva down. The guy that was tough, the best, like clearly one of the on the Mount Rushmore of just MMA, not just UFC. So I don't know if it's enough to get him the respect of the boxing community, which is inevitably what he needs to do if he wants to like get this world championship that he keeps talking about, because Anderson Silva is not a boxer. If he did this to like Tommy Fury or Rachmanov Jr., it's a different story, but this is you can't overstate how impressive it is to beat Anderson Silva, especially from the MMA crowd. Because I went on Twitter, I was following along, like DC was talking about him, Mike Casey was talking about it, like people were tuning in to watch Anderson Silva beat Jake Paul, and he did it. You can't take it away from him.
Let's talk about what this all means. And obviously, let's start with Anderson, right?
Yeah.
Because, again, living legend on the Mount Rushmore, one of the greatest of all time. He now joins this club with Ben and Tyron as having lost to Jake Paul, and Jake Paul has some highlights on him. That loss for those other guys has followed them in a pretty profound way. It is somewhat inescapable on the internet, social media, etc. Whenever they do anything, you just find Jake Paul in their comment section. We talked in the lead up to this of what this would mean to Anderson's legacy. His legacy is very different than those two men, and his legacy is one of the biggest in the sport. Does this become a part of his legacy, do you think?
I don't think it's going to be as negatively affected as Tyron and Ben, because the build-up to that fight was a lot of trash talk. It was pretty, like the press conferences was pretty heated. The media, like we saw Jake Paul like confront Ben Askren like during medicals. We saw the press conference. We saw the face-to-face. Tyron Woodley wanted to hurt this dude. Ben Askren wanted to hurt this dude. Yeah, we saw War Anderson, but I would just think that was Anderson turning it on. I don't think he genuinely had animosity towards Jake Paul. So the fact that the build-up was friendly, Jake Paul said nothing but positive things until like they had the stare down. It is what it is. I think Jake Paul's going to talk about obviously beating Anderson, but he's not going to like hold it over Anderson's head. It doesn't seem like that's the guy, especially if they're going to do this fighters union thing that they're talking about. I think that if that inevitably comes to fruition, that's the story that's going to follow Anderson.
So let's talk about the fighters union thing, because now that's on the table, right?
Yeah.
That was the bet.
I think they would have probably tried to do it even if.
But now there's more impetus to do it, right? That was the bet. Either a kickboxing match or you're gonna start this fighters union with me. Do you think this is something realistic, and do you think this is something we will actually see movement and progression on now moving forward?
I think if they take this slow approach and they don't just, because we've seen all these unions try to happen before, and I feel like they just try to just do something major right away, and they just try to change the game in a week, and it never works out. if they get Anderson and they get George, like George's obviously tried to do this before, but now that he's out of the UFC, maybe he tries it again. And they didn't say it's just UFC. They just said this is all MMA.
No, they wanted all MMA.
They wanted all MMA. George and Anderson they're the guys I described in the previous show. They walk into a room, everyone gets out of the way. They talk, everyone listens. They're two of the names you need. So I think if it's going to happen, it's never been more realistic than it has right now.
Well, let's talk about what's next, because I think last time we saw Jake Paul fight, obviously the Tyron Woodley fight, it was a big question mark, right? We came away from that fight being like, okay, he just knocked out Tyron Woodley, but what really is next? It didn't feel like an obvious answer to leap from. Today, I think it's a big difference, right? We saw Nate Diaz here. He was a presence all throughout fight week, supporting Chris Avila. He got into a little bit of an altercation here backstage. Our boy Casey was there on the scene. There is obvious tension here. There's obvious money to be made here. Is there any way that it isn't Nate Diaz next, do you think?
I mean, if it's not Nate Diaz, it's going to be because of Nate Diaz's side, probably. Maybe, like, he keeps tweeting about, like, oh, let's not entertain, like, the phonies, and I'm only here for the real ones. But at the end of the day, Nate is a prize fighter, and he left the UFC for a reason, to try things.
Nate Diaz likes money.
Nate Diaz loves money. And me and Casey where we saw him, like, when right before the entrances, Nate walked out, and in that moment, if Anderson, Jake, and Nate Diaz were all in the arena, Nate Diaz would still have been the most popular person in that arena. There was a line of maybe 400 people waiting to get a photo with him.
He got the biggest pop of the night.
Without question, he got the biggest pop of the night. If I'm Jake, I do everything in my power to fight Nate Diaz, because I think Jake Paul could very easily be, not easily, but like the
You'd
thought
pick him.
I would pick Jake Paul to beat Nate Diaz right now. Maybe that's just like recency bias. Maybe I just haven't sat down and thought about it. I've seen Nate Diaz fight. Jake Paul is a very large man that hits really hard. Nate Diaz is not known for one that can just melt you. Never seen Nate Diaz in a boxing match, so maybe that has something to do with it too. But if the biggest fight that they can make right now, based on the reception that Nate got and Jake's performance, is Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz. Whether it happens or not is on Nate's shoulders, I think.
I would be stunned if we don't end up seeing that fight, because it is so much money now at stake in that. There's so much money you'd be leaving on the table if that's not the next move. And every step this week, it felt like they were laying the breadcrumbs for that, right? They were planting the seeds. Even up to Nate Diaz walking past us in the right before weigh-ins while a Jake Paul promo is playing, and then he calls out Nate in that promo, and Nate flips him off. Everything aligned this whole week. The way these two guys would be intersecting at the points in their career they would be. Nate Diaz just coming off of the UFC. He's probably more popular now than he's ever been before. And Jake Paul just knocked down and beat Anderson Silva. How big do you think that fight could be?
A million pay-per-views, I think.
You think that's the first Paul fight to cross the mill?
I do, because Anderson Silva is beloved by the masses of MMA, but Nate Diaz is a guy that really crosses over to both. Like, he has a sect of fans that just adore him, and they are Team Diaz to the, like, it doesn't matter who he fights. They are there, and they're gonna pick him to win, and they're probably gonna fight you if you pick against Nate. Nate's fan base and Anderson's fan base are different. Anderson is a beloved figure. Nate is a cult icon. Nate is a guy that, like, you'll see someone walking down the street with a Team Diaz jersey. Not a UFC shirt, Team Diaz. It's Diaz versus the UFC. It's Diaz versus the world, as they always say. So I really think that could be a million pay-per-view buys. I really do.
Let me throw you another option. Where does Joe Riggs figure into this?
Hey, I was wondering, like, it's been about 12, 15 minutes, and we haven't talked about Joe Riggs. Like, what do we even
Frankly, that's the real money.
Like, Casey came in all the way from LA. And this is the first moment we're talking about Joe Riggs. We have failed in our journalistic integrity. I apologize, everybody.
Well, you know, everybody who knows Anderson knows Joe Riggs.
Shit, man.
Everybody. That's a rule.
I mean, when you say it out loud, it just makes sense.
It does.
Yeah.
Well, let's close with this, man, because obviously Anderson, you know, it's not the first time we've seen him lose.
Nope.
He's 47 years old.
Yep.
This post-UFC career felt miraculous almost in a way. If you remember where he was when he came off the UFC, right? I think he lost 9 of his last 10 or something like that.
I don't think it was that. It was like 4 or 5, because he had long stretches that
it
felt
was
longer.
It was ultimately a very bad run. But now this boxing thing, he's really found a revival. He was looking so good in these various fights, Tito, Chavez Jr. Now this. What's next for Anderson? Do you sort of want to see him call it from here? Or
No.
do you just want to see him keep fighting these fights and doing, the Legends Tour, maybe?
I want to see him keep fighting if he wants to keep fighting. Until it's sad to watch, I hope Anderson keeps fighting. Because he didn't, he got dropped by a 25-year-old, but he was very much in there. That fight, he was very competitive. Now, do I want to see him fight like Canelo? No. But I mean, I'll pay to watch him fight Roy Jones Jr.
I was going to say, is Roy Jones Jr. finally time for this?
I freaking hope so, man. I would love everything about that. That should have happened in 2011. Now, the fact that we're getting it 11 years later is a little bit annoying, but yeah, I really want to see that fight very, very badly. And until he looks old, until Father Time catches up, I have no problem with Anderson continuing this.
I mean, he looked old tonight, but he still
did,
looked
but
like...
you know what I mean.
He still had moments where he looked like Anderson Silva.
Correct.
Well, man, it's been a weird week.
Yes, it has.
Weird night.
It's been a weird couple of weeks, guys.
Well, it is what it is. Jake Paul now has Anderson Silva on the resume, and this little boxing run at Anderson's is taking its first speed bump.
It's been a rough couple of months for Brazilian fighters, huh? Glover,
It
Aldo,
really has.
Charles, Anderson. Man, Nunes got her title back, and they got Figueiredo coming up in Rio, but man, it's been a rough couple of months for Brazilian icons. Hopefully Shogun isn't added to that list.
I'm not gonna throw the jinx on that. But anyway, thank you guys for keeping with us all week as we've brought you coverage from Jake Paul versus Anderson Silva here in Glendale. His name is Jose Youngs. My name is Shaun Al-Shatti. We appreciate you guys. Keep it locked to MMA Fighting, and we'll see you soon.